Hello everyone, welcome to this, our third seminar in relation to responsible stewardship of wealth. My name is Bryony Cove, I'm a partner at Farrow & Co Solicitors. We are partners with the IFB and I'm very pleased to see you here. I'm joined once again by Philip Marcovici, who very kindly joined us for the last two sessions. He is the co-author of the Responsible Stewardship of Wealth report, which kicked off this series. We have heard from Kath Dovey in our second session around philanthropy, and today I'm absolutely delighted that we also have Iraj Isfahani, who together with Kenneth Goh has co-authored a new book, Applying Circular Economy Principles to Family Business and Wealth Stewardship. Philip is known to you, but just as a reminder, he is a consultant and retired practitioner in private wealth advice, management to families, etc. He now consults for families and businesses and government, and is highly thought of in the field of family governance, particularly in relation to family businesses. So thank you very much, Philip, for coming again. Iraj joins us, and you may remember that he was with us for the in-person conference in June 2022 and gave a fantastic talk there. I think he probably ought to introduce himself. So Iraj, over to you to introduce yourself to our viewers and listeners.
Thank you, Bryony, and hello everyone. I am Iraj Isfahani, and I think for today's conversation there are two things which are possibly helpful. One is I'm on the board of my family business, where I've served the past dozen years, and it's a business which is, I think, about 203 years old now. So we've had longevity and a lot of experience of many of the things that families with businesses face over generations. And we have, to some extent, stood the test of time. So hopefully some of my lived experience will be useful. In parallel, as some of you may know, I also lead Isfahani Advisory, which advises other business and wealth owners on some of the issues that we'll be touching on today. Thank you, Bryony.
Thanks so much, Iraj. It's lovely to have you here. The book that we're talking about today and the principles we're talking about today, the book was published in spring 2022. I have to say, I have found it a fabulous resource, which I've shared with some of my families I know, with some real imaginative thought, original thought around concepts, but also mapping business strategies onto how families look after their wealth. So I think that it would be really helpful, Philip, if you could just sort of set out some of the key messages which are here on the executive summary. I should explain that these slides, we're going to dip in and out of particular slides we think are important, but the slide deck itself could be a very useful resource, particularly if you're reading the book. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through 6 or 7 of the slides today that are most relevant to you as an audience, in our view. But over to you, Philip, to talk a little bit about the principles.
Thanks, Bryony. It's probably good for me to put the work that Iraj and I have done together with a friend of ours, Kenneth Goh, who's a professor in Singapore and heads up the Business Families Institute, which is part of the Singapore Management University. A bit of background about how we got into these ideas, I think, are going to help frame what it is that we're going to discuss in this session today. Iraj and I have been doing a lot of teaching together, and among others, we're currently working with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership on programs that are oriented towards wealth and business owning families. And there's a program that we're involved in there that has to do with multi-generational leadership. Before our involvement with CISL, we were working with the Cambridge Judge Business School. And Iraj and I were there for some lectures, and one of the teachers in the program, Professor Cal Sufani, was leading a session on the circular economy. And it was one of my first exposures to a concept that I had heard a lot about. And as Cal was going through explaining what circular economy was all about, I began to think about how the principles of the circular economy could be applied to business and wealth owning families themselves. Now, largely when we talk about circular economy, what we're talking about is not only avoiding waste and creating waste, but actually finding uses for waste and in a way celebrating what is in the manufacturing process, often, the waste that is created. And when you think about this in the context of families and family businesses, it actually changes the thinking, as we're going to go through, in many, many different areas. Because what becomes important when you're applying these concepts to families themselves is to really think carefully, what steps are we taking to ensure that we're not wasting any human resources, family resources within the family? How can we make sure we're making best use of everyone in the younger generation? How can we ensure that we're making best use of spouses? How can we make sure that we're making best use of family elders and the whole system within the family as it deals with people moving through the age of retirement and beyond? As we're going to touch on, it really gets exciting when you think in the concept of circularity and how this can impact a succession plan, an asset protection plan, a business transition plan within a family.
Thanks so much, Philip. And I think this is fascinating, not least because we know that particularly in the Western economies, the next generations are coming through, and they're going to expect to maybe dip in and out of the family business and not necessarily commit their entire lives or not commit at all. So these circular principles, I think, are fascinating for us to think about and for the families to get to grips with. In terms of how generations work, we're going to move on now, I think, to talk a little bit with Iraj about generational differences. There can be a huge amount of friction between the generations, and there can be natural friction, which should be there, but there can be stoppers on how the family is able to best retain and nurture and bring on not only family members, but also the wealth itself. And Iraj, I know that you're very thoughtful on the concepts of regeneration and making sure that constant vigilance is the key. Perhaps you could say a few words around the self-regeneration concept.
Thank you, Bryony. So as I've often said, I think all families have to manage their own context. So this is not ever an intention of Philip's or mine to be prescriptive about what people should do, but I think what we all know is the world around us is full of disruption and changing very fast. Some of that is fueled by geopolitical change, some of it is by technology, some of it is regulation. And the most important thing in this environment is actually families do everything that they can to help themselves weather the storm, prepare for change, think about what are the right questions to be asking rather than rushing to the answers, because we're seeing things which we haven't necessarily seen or experienced before. And in this, of course, we're also coming from a world which was typically a world of patriarchy, and in family businesses, often the families and the older generations will say, and I hope some of you are nodding along with this, which is, well, this is how we've always done it. It stood us in good stead, so why change? And yet, but that conversation, that attitude is not going to bring the younger members of the family to the table as willing participants. And actually what we're suggesting is, for the family as a whole, there needs to be a conversation which includes every generation. And so if you think about the table, what do you do to enable people to be around that table, to feel that they're heard and their ideas are baked in, or at least considered for the future betterment of the family? And as Brian has indicated, it doesn't mean that the younger generations necessarily feel that their destiny is in the business, but they can be very additive to the business and supportive of the family more broadly, if they feel they have a part to play and it's not narrowly defined. So I think we'll touch on how this can be flexed later on, but very simply, today there's a conversation happening not just in family businesses, but more broadly about purpose. One of the great things with family businesses is the linkage between, as many of you know, between business and society and community has always been very evident from the outset. And it's how a self-regenerative family will review purpose today, because younger generations may have a different take on how that purpose can be fulfilled or should be defined. So that there will be disagreements and tensions in these conversations, but our proposition, our suggestion is that that's certainly worth trying to have those conversations.
And Iraj, there is a sort of element to this of greater good, in that if you don't look after each individual, then the whole is less stable and has less integrity. And I think you should talk about that concept that we've talked about so many times yourself, about how you look at that.
Well, I think one of the things, of course, which in the sort of slightly sort of straitjacketed world that we came from, which was you were either in or you were out, or there were certain ways of doing things, or you had to live in a certain country to be part of the business or be on the board. All of these things actually lead to diminishing, realizing the potential and the capacity and capabilities of all family members. And so one of the things which one example that I'll give you, which Brian, I think which may be helpful, is you have to recognize that the success of an individual family member is not necessarily to the detriment of the well-being of the family. So someone, for instance, if you, and Philip and I often talk about this, that actually to enable younger members of the family to become financially independent sooner is a good thing, because with that confidence, they'll be in a better position to contribute to the thinking about the overall family enterprise, rather than feel that they're entirely dependent on it from the outset. So let me pause there, but that would be one example.
And I think that's a really interesting example, because where a family member does, at a young age, have a degree of financial independence, however that is provided for them, whether it's self-generated or otherwise, I think, as you say, I mean, what I see in the next generations coming through, particularly the clients I see in their 20s, is if they are well set up, they don't fear the family business or the risk they're taking in making a commitment to the family business, because it is a risk at the end of the day that it may not work out, and it could feel quite unpleasant if it doesn't work out. But if they've already got another career, they've got their own home, they stand on their own 2 feet in English parlance, they're probably in a much better position to make good judgments about how their role in the family business is going to develop.
And just continuing with that briefly, you can we often talk about people leaving family businesses, people choosing not to go into family business. We talk about the exit, but of course the other thing that Philip and I always talk about, which is also inherent in circularity, is what is the on-ramp? How do people come back?
Yes.
And that's circular. You can leave, you should feel free to leave, but you must also understand what are the circumstances under which you will be very welcome to come back with your new experience and ideas and initiatives and networks.
And Philip, I think you call that the revolving door.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, with all of these new ideas, and we're going to move on slightly now, of course, involving the whole family means a degree of flexibility. It means when we're looking at how to enunciate for families and with families and help them enunciate their own mission and purpose and strategies, and identify their own challenges. You know, there's no one size fits all, and I've long thought in my practice that a family constitution can be helpful, but it's not for everybody. And I know, Philip, that you and I have fairly strong ideas about this, but I'm going to hand over to you to talk a little bit about how families can enunciate their purpose.
Thanks, Brian. The reality is families, in one way or another, you know, no plan is a plan. So it doesn't really matter what you're planning. There is a plan in place, and that plan may actually be no plan. So what's important for every family, in my view, is that they understand what's going to happen in certain circumstances in relation to succession, in relation to disability, and all of these kind of things. So families that have a family constitution, that can be a very useful place to articulate, you know, what the family has in mind, and then the constitution, which usually is not a legally binding document, the thinking in that constitution should find its way into the family partnerships, trusts, foundations, whatever it is the family is employing as the tools in the succession. But this whole concept of circularity that we're talking about changes the way family constitutions, shareholders agreements, other arrangements actually might work. And we've already touched on some of the changes in thinking that come up that can be pretty exciting. For example, we talked a little bit about exits and the revolving door. The reality is that in many families, and a lot of advisors to families in business, the approach that they've taken is to put in place exit procedures. They put in place in shareholders agreements and otherwise very commercial terms about how to deal with a family member who's exiting, how their share will be valued, how the family can prune the family tree. And what a lot of family business advisors have been saying is, for good succession, you need to prune the family tree. The approach that Iraj and I and Kenneth have begun to take in our thinking around circularity is to say, no, instead of having an exit, we have what we refer to as a revolving door, meaning every family member has the ability to distance themselves from the family, but at the same time, there's an ability to get closer at different times in life to the family and the family business. And then reward systems, which should be very, very transparent, come into play. And again, we've touched on this a little bit by saying, the more independent financially the younger generation can be, usually the better they can contribute to the long-term stewardship of those assets within the family, such as the family business, that are to be held for multiple generations. It's all about transparency. So in the family constitutions and all the related governance document, the idea is that everyone in the family should have a clear understanding of what their expectations are, what the family's expectations are about the different roles family members can play, and then the rewards that come into that. So for example, it may be beneficial for the family to encourage all late teenagers, so in 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds are encouraged to do an internship in the family business. And what that may result in is perhaps financial support for university studies. So one clarity is, if I'm a member of this family and I do an internship within family business, this is what I'm going to get out of it. If I'm going to run certain things, this is what I'm going to get out of it. Having this kind of clarity is part of the circularity and the thinking on family members having the ability to pursue their own interests now and come back into being closer to the family business later. That's part of this idea of recirculating the resources within the family and ensuring that we're not wasting any resources within the family. So that's the broad idea.
That's very on point. And I think from a practical point of view, what I see is that if you have a leader of a family with 4 children, for example, one of the children says, I want an exit and I'm taking the rest of my family with me. What do you do when that grandchild comes back 15, 20 years later and says, well, that's not what I wanted. It wasn't my choice. Why can't I come back? And if there isn't that flexibility of thinking, you're sort of, they're cast out into outer space, as it were. And I think that is a very dangerous thing for that.
It's precisely
go through.
Yeah, and it's precisely the point, because if that grandchild in your example, Bryony, thinks that they're part of the family branch that is no longer part of the family business, that grandchild just doesn't think about what they could contribute to that family business. From a very young age, they've been completely cut out of it. But if the dialogue within the family is, if you're a member of this family, the door is always open, and it's up to you to take advantage of that open door. We have a procedure about how you can come back into the family fold, into the family business. This is a very dynamic way of changing the conversation within the family. And usually when you have a family branch that's exiting, someone in the 2nd generation or 3rd generation who says, I want to go, there's usually some bad feeling associated with that. And if at the time of that discussion about that exit, there's a clear message saying you can distance yourself from the family. There is an exit, but your children and your grandchildren and even you are always welcome to reconsider and come back. That changes the dynamic of the conversation.
Which I think brings us on to our sort of next, the next part of the book that we wanted to talk about. There's obviously some quite complex thinking involved here, and it may feel quite different for families to adjust their thinking to have this flexibility of people revolving or coming and going from involvement with the wealth or with the business. And I know that, again, Iraj, you have thought long and hard with Philip and Kenneth about paradoxical thinking. And I wonder if you could just sort of bring that to life a little bit, because it feels like we're talking about something that for some families will feel quite complex, but actually if they can get paradoxical thinking well understood, then it should become a bit easier, I think.
Thank you, Bryony. So what paradox thinking does is it really, and it aims to support maximizing, making the most of the family. So if we bear that in mind, it allows you to think about not the option of doing either one thing or the other thing, which is by definition exclusive. It allows you to think about and both. It's how things can actually work together, which appear to be in conflict. And inherent in that is an approach which is patient, but the patience actually can pay dividends because you get to a better place and you preempt some of the disharmony and tension that Philip and Bryony both referred to earlier, when families decide they can't rub together and they go completely separate ways. And you create history when you do those things, and history is very difficult to unwind. But one example I'll give you is I'm assuming that many of the members who are listening today, the IFB members, some will be founder businesses, many will be second generation businesses. The important thing to think about is how you build in this more flexible approach, because inevitably shareholdings become more fragmented with every generation. There will inevitably be people who are not qualified to be in the business or choose not to be in the business, but remain shareholders and remain part of the family. So it's much more difficult in long-standing multi-generational families to unwind some of the practices we put into place. But those who are earlier in the generational cycle, I would encourage you to think about how you adopt these things. So I'll give you an example. In a multi-generational family that I know, well, I think 7th, 8th generation, they had a rule that you had to live in that particular country if you were going to work in the family business. And of course, as time changed, family members started living in other parts of the world, and they were precluded from being in the business by location. Then the rules evolved to say that there could be, you could be a non-executive director, but you still had to live in the country where the business was headquartered. That in itself was very restrictive in terms of the talent the family needed to have at the table to help the business. But when the conversations started to happen, instead of being polarized and saying it's not possible, it was decided with technology, with communications, with ease of travel, that those rules needed to be updated, and you could be a family member and a member of the board and live in a third country with no issue whatsoever. And so this is an iterative one. It's a great solution, but it takes time. And I think that the way the world is going now, one can actually one doesn't have to have situations like that arising.
And if I can jump in here, Raj, the whole concept of circularity is, and you've given a good example about, in a way, avoiding waste. If you have a family member who's living in another geography, are you wasting that resource by denying them the ability to be part of the structures of the family business? But even more importantly, Now that you've decided we're not going to waste that resource, and in your example, that person who's living in a different geography is welcome to be part of the family business, we then come to the next question, which is, how can we now get additional benefit out of that waste? In other words, what additional value does our family business get by virtue of the fact that that family member is living outside? That could be because they have a perspective from outside the relevant country. What I'm doing with a lot of families where their family businesses are in tricky developing world countries is using the family members in the US, in Canada, in other jurisdictions to provide some elements of political risk minimization. You may even want those family members to own certain assets of the family for the family, because the ownership is safer in their hands than it may be in the hands of the family members who are on the ground in tricky countries around the world, which sadly there are more and more of these tricky countries. So I think your example is really super, because what it does is it allows us to show the way this thinking is, the way the thinking is, and it's very welcome when you start to discuss this within the family. The thinking is we celebrate, not punish, diversity. We celebrate, not punish diversity in what you want to do, where you want to live, and how you want to live. And we use that diversity to strengthen what our family and our family business is about. It's a wonderful conversation within families.
And Philip, just picking up on the aspect you touched on, which refers to new ideas and innovation, because you're absolutely right. Circularity it's about avoidance of waste, but it's also about it's about being accretive. How are you additive by inclusion? And with that in mind, if you think about Gen Z today, Gen Z they take a different view of the world, but you have to try and understand that view. But with that, they're all digital natives. Which family business does not need to understand how to operate in the digital environment more effectively than all of us currently do today? It's a huge opportunity. And actually, if you talk about intergenerational communication, all older generations can certainly learn from these digital natives about how to actually have businesses that are prepared and more relevant for the changing business environment. So I think this is about, and actually, of course, as we will touch on in this conversation later, within circularity, all generations are important.
Yeah. And I think that's a very interesting part of the book for me. Again, sort of coming back to the more practical aspects and moving on to how this actually works for the families. In terms of succession planning, which is often the biggest topic for families when they come and talk to any one of us, circularity principles haven't got through yet, but we are getting there. And moving on to those circularity and succession planning points, which I think are a bit later on in the slides if you have them in front of you, but we will go through them. The reality for families is that they're all different. How you divide your assets or keep them together, and how you benefit, how you don't benefit, how you earn the right to benefit. This will all, I think, if a family is being flexible and applying these principles, it will again become more complex, but it may make an awful lot more sense to families in terms of what age people can benefit, how the family statements are expressed, the governance documentation, etc., and also as we've said, valuing the older generations. There are, family separations happen, whether it's divorce, separation between siblings, or other divisions. But I do think there's a real place for this circularity principle and acceptance of division and acceptance of disruption. And Philip, I think you're pretty, you have some fairly sort of strong views on actually that acceptance model, enabling these succession planning projects to be much healthier.
So I'll make some general comments here rather than going through each of the elements that are in the slide about succession planning. And I really encourage everyone to read the book and engage in dialogue within their families on some of these concepts. But for me, what circularity and circular thinking really focuses on is, again, not wasting resources. And if you think about not wasting resources, you have to then consider that dialogue within families early on about the succession process, about how things will be divided up, about ages at which family members benefit, about incapacity, about divorce. Having these conversations early on within the family is absolutely critical. I often tell families, don't wait to discuss prenups with your kids until they come home holding hands with the love of their life. Because if you talk about prenups when they come home with their true love, they're going to interpret the discussion about prenups as a judgment of the person that they've decided to spend their life with. Rather, the discussion should be taking place very, very early on. Same thing to avoid waste in all of these areas about ages of benefit, incapacity. For example, if I don't let a 13 or 14-year-old family member know what the financial deal is, they don't need to know numbers, but they should know what the deal is. In other words, if the deal is they're going to have their education paid for, but they're not going to come into any serious wealth until they're 40 or 50 or 60, the time to communicate that to them is not when they're 25 or 30, after they've made their educational decisions, but rather when they're 12 or 13, when they can prepare themselves for having to earn their own living for a period of time before the family wealth might come into the picture. So the earlier you have this open dialogue, the more you can ensure you're not wasting resources in that younger generation. Now, with the older generation, having a dialogue about incapacity and aging and discussing under what circumstances signing authorities may be taken away or should be given up voluntarily, at what age and what assets should remain under the signing authority of someone who's going through normal forms of dementia, which are all too common. The more we discuss this within the family early on, before you have people suffering that situation, the more you're preventing a waste of resources, the more you're preventing someone feeling that they have no value to the family, because you're discussing before these events take place how we can maximize the value that a family elder can provide, and to do that in a way that's safe for within the family. And then finally, another comment would be in relation to divorces and second families. I've spent decades of my own career always thinking in very black and white terms about gold digging young spouses and the fear of divorce and how this can be destructive of family wealth. I've spent my career trying to help people avoid that kind of situation. But what I've come into thinking more and more in view of applying circular principles is that we are losing a resource if we don't think carefully about what even that perceived gold digging young new spouse coming into the family could contribute if we approach things in a very circular way. And by being clear about what the economic deal is for that new spouse, and at the same time welcoming that new spouse into the family rather than creating barriers and walls, this may actually bring a happier family and minimize the kind of financial disruptions that could arise. So I put all of these topics in succession planning in the same range of areas that absolutely families need to discuss from the perspective, how can we approach aging? How can we approach how much and when family members get benefit? How can we approach divorces, prenups, second families, all of these issues? How can we approach these issues in a way that not only doesn't waste resources, but takes advantage of the resources the family has?
Sorry, it's a very interesting point about in-laws, in the sense that they are going to be the parent of the next generation after that. And actually, if you're generous and you accept that that marriage may or may not succeed, but that they are potentially going to be, and may in fact be, the parent of another generation, what you don't want if there is a divorce is for that parent to then undermine the whole endeavour, because they've never been included and they don't know what it's for, and they're just
which happens all too often, as you know,
which I think is just really sad. Sorry, Iraj.
Brian, I was just thank you. I was just going to add to Philip's comments, because when you look at the topics that are listed on this slide, these are all sources of huge tension and difficulty in families. And I'm sure everyone listening today will have had some experience of, at least one of these issues. And the fact is that when you, and as Philip, Kenneth and I have been sort of pondering about the benefits that the circular approach can bring to families, what we look at is really, we've created in a way some shock absorber thinking and ideas which can help families preempt some of this. It doesn't mean these things won't happen, but when they do happen, the protocols are clearer under which decisions can be taken and communicated. And what it does is it actually creates what I describe as relational hygiene within a family, which is so important, because it also therefore allows for some residual respect to continue through difficult situations, or people to say, well, actually, this is there is this doesn't pit us against each other in the way that other more sort of naked agreements might. And I think it's just worth bearing that in mind, because actually, critically, the biggest, as I often say, as we know, the biggest disruptors to family businesses is it's not the market, it's not external shareholders, it's not volatility in the economy, it's what families do to themselves. And that's why these internal dynamics, reflecting on how we can help ourselves more as families, I think is really what's encouraged us to keep having these discussions and encouraging people to adopt and embed circularity where they can.
Thank you so much, both. That's an absolutely critical part of, I think, how members will benefit from reading the book and listening to this session. Part of the integrity, of course, of your concepts is allowing people to go away and do their own thing. We know that in many families, the next generation are naturally quite entrepreneurial, and whether they're helping the family business be more entrepreneurial, whether it's going to go into new areas, diversify, invest in new businesses, perhaps more modern businesses, you start to see this creation of what you've called the family bank. And I think if we can move on to talk about that, I find this concept fascinating, in that what you don't do is, again, have hard lines. I'm here, you're over there, the business is over there. There's much more fluidity. And Iraj, I think if you can sort of explain how your thinking with Philip and Kenneth has developed around the family bank, that would be really, really great.
Absolutely, Riley. So in our thinking, the family bank is either it's a concept or it's a more crystallized, concrete idea. And essentially, every business family, whether it's founder-led or multi-generational, needs to keep the spirit of enterprise alive, and needs to continue in every generation, because there are more mouths to feed, and et cetera, et cetera. So how does one do that? Now, Brian, as you mentioned, a lot of the younger generation are enterprising. A lot of people want to prove themselves to some extent before joining the family business, or to go on a different journey to find out what it is, where they can make their own mark in life. And of course, one of the at the same time, families want to give the next generation opportunity to learn, but with perhaps some trainer wheels on. So with the family bank, a concept is that simply a next gen member can approach the family for support for a project he or she wants to undertake, which is a business idea. If the business plan is approved, and let's say there's an investment committee that approves it, then they can get some funding from the family, which may be 80% debt, 20% equity stake that the family takes in this new entity. If the new business is successful, the debt gets repaid, and there is a new entity in which the family as a group has a 20% stake. So that's a win-win for the family member and for the family. They've supported someone in that direction. Now, if it's not successful, but of course some lessons will have been learned, some experience will have been gained, the next gen family member has that 20% paid off through their future expectations of dividend, etc., from the family. So this is something which is as I said, can be closely, narrowly defined with investment committees and business plans reviewed carefully, but it can also be a concept which is, don't hesitate to ask us as a family if you're thinking of doing something else. We may be able to support you. And again, that creates the conversation, which often doesn't happen. So I think that's where I would say the family bank can work extremely well.
I think it also is a more welcoming way of challenging younger generations to really sort of prove themselves in terms of being able to raise their own funds for an entrepreneurial endeavour, to really have thought through the risks and what damage it might do to their own reputation within the family if they haven't done a proper job. You know, they may be too young to appreciate that this may cast them in a very different light to that which they would like to be seen. And there are all sorts of self-awareness, I think, concepts around that as well, which are very, very valuable.
Absolutely. And so I think one of the, and in understanding that there is support that can come from the family in supporting the business is very helpful, because actually there are all sorts of resources a family business may have, which could be deployed to make this venture much more successful than if you're getting third-party funding on a completely sort of detached basis. So I think that's one. But on the flip side, and I think one of the things that if you talk to Gen Z certainly, but you talk to some millennials also who might have had that experience, their concern about taking the family shilling in this way was, to your point, if we don't succeed, then we marked, our card is marked for life. And that'll never be forgotten. So I think there has to be in this an element of, this is worthwhile experience for our next generation who we want to invest in a particular way. And yes, there may be a cost, but of course you're going to do your due diligence as well and take a view in terms of whether something is backable or not. So there are, this isn't a free pass, but I think it can be done in a way that there's the motivations and the mutual support is recognized.
Another resource that families have that this touches on is a sense of fairness and family members working together. If the younger generation really work together, that's a huge strength for any family, regardless of whether they have a family business or not. In every family, it's inevitable that parents will end up helping one child a little bit more than another child at different points in their lives. Everyone is developing differently. If there's no clarity when this kind of help is given to one child over another child, that can create disharmony among that generation. You have a sibling who says, oh, mom, dad, you were always favoring X, or you were giving more money to X, and now that money's been lost. So if there's a child who the parents are helping with financially, perhaps because they're starting their own businesses or for other reasons, this notion of a family bank where there's a clarity regarding what the deal actually is can go far to avoiding future disputes among the siblings. So if my sister is getting some extra money from parents, if it's very clear that that extra money is in effect a loan from the parents that will eventually come out of the eventual inheritance that my sister might get, that might be a better thing than if there were no recording made at all of these differentials in what different children may be getting from their parents. So the family bank also plays this role of allowing the family to discuss what is the deal if any of you among the younger generation need money, maybe to start your own business, maybe for more education that other siblings may not be getting. How do we account for that within the family in a way that's very open and very fair? That's what part of this is all about.
Thank you, Philip. Just conscious of time, we're running at about 45 minutes now. We've just got one further point that we were going to cover. And again, we're coming back to you, Iraj, about cultural and religious approaches to succession. Of course, families are unique in their own way, but then cultures will also inform their decision making. And I know that you're keen to learn from different cultures, and as we've already talked about, having a family member in a different country will help inform the wider picture. If you could maybe just talk a little bit more about this last point on how cultural and religious approaches can benefit the family, and how this fits in with the ideas in the book.
Absolutely. So I think, and this is a very important one. I think, as we said at the outset, families have to manage their own context, and of course, their own context is hugely influenced by both the culture and the society they live in, and what the religious requirements or constraints are in that environment. And if you look at the lessons from Sharia, for instance, the one thing that Sharia has got very much in its favor is clarity. It's very clear who gets what. And that, I think, echoes some of the thinking that in circularity is clarity. It helps with succession planning. It helps with understanding what is meant to go where. But of course, what is not present in Sharia is the equality of treatment between genders, and so of course that runs counter to our circularity principles, which is about including everybody and making the most of everyone in a family. And so I think partly we need to make sure that you have the ability to you have your religious norms and requirements are a starting point, but if you wish to include people fully and wholly, how do you build around that? I think that's really the way that we would encourage people to think about it. Should they wish to do something more?
Thank you, Raj. I think that's very helpful, and it is important to always remember that cultural differences will also have an impact. I think we're sort of really at the end of what we were going to talk about. We do have some further slides, and you will all be sent a copy of the slide deck on the tax side. But in conclusion, these ideas are very accessible. They are easy to read. The book is short but very full and rich in its content. Families who are better informed, we all think, have a better experience of the path of succession. And I think just as a sort of final thank you, we can all benefit from what some people find quite academic thinking, but actually has very, very practical applications. And I think what Philip and Iraj and Kenneth, who isn't with us today, have done is encapsulate some of those very accessible principles and concepts that families can use in their discussions with with each other, with their advisors, with the people that love them and nurture them and want them to succeed, with the people in their businesses who are very committed to their success as well, who may not be family members. And so this really is a publication for all. thank you so much to Philip and to Iraj for taking the time to prepare and come and talk to us again today. This concludes our three-part series on responsible stewardship. Our work continues, and we will hopefully be communicating again with you through the IFB. And thank you very much for listening.
Thanks,
Bye,
Brian.
everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bryony.
Thank you. We're done.